The galaxy learned the name of humanity through contempt before it learned it through fear, because when the Orbit Coalition issued its final ultimatum to Earth, the tone was calm and certain, spoken from marble halls and broadcast across 1,000 systems as if the matter were already finished, and on Earth the message played on screens in city squares and command centers, while alien representatives waited for surrender that never came, because the Coalition had decided that humanity would accept defeat the way weaker species always did, quietly and with relief, and Ethan Brooks listened to the broadcast from a hardened room beneath the Nevada desert while technicians stood still around him, each of them hearing the same words that declared Earth in violation of interstellar law, its fleets restricted, its skies monitored, its independence suspended for the safety of the galaxy, and the Coalition speaker promised mercy if compliance was immediate, and Ethan said nothing at first, because he had spent 30 years in uniform learning, when silence mattered more than anger, and Laura Bennett watched him from across the table with her hands folded, as if she were in a hearing instead of the center of the largest deception in human history. Because even now the aliens did not know what Earth had built, and they did not know that the final broadcast they prepared would become a lesson taught in every academy for centuries, as reports flowed in from orbit where Coalition enforcement ships took their positions with careful spacing, confident and bored, while on the lunar far side Admiral Victor Hale watched human vessels remain dark and motionless as ordered, their transponders silent, their weapons cold, playing a role expected of them, and the aliens mistook restraint for weakness because that mistake had always worked before, and on the Coalition flagship an alien commander named Sereth reviewed population numbers and resource tables, already planning the redistribution of Earth's output, because the humans had protested loudly in early negotiations and then grown quiet. And quiet always meant surrender, while on Earth the quiet meant something else entirely. It meant synchronization, and when the Coalition deadline expired and the speaker returned to the broadcast channel to announce the formal end of human sovereignty, Ethan finally stood and nodded once, and that single motion triggered a chain that had been waiting for years, because beneath, oceans and deserts and cities, systems woke that had never been acknowledged publicly, and Laura began to speak into a secure link that did not appear on any alien sensor, her voice calm as she confirmed that every ARC, every reserve fleet, every deep-range platform reported ready. And the first hint of change came when Coalition scanners detected mass distortions where there should have been none, dismissed at first as instrument error, until the moon itself began to shift, not breaking apart, but opening, layers sliding with mechanical precision as ancient-looking structures unfolded and powered on, and Admiral Hale watched alien ships drift in confusion as human vessels emerged not from Earth orbit, but from positions that should have been empty space, because humanity had learned early that hiding was better than shielding, and the Coalition speaker faltered as alerts flooded their displays, still trying to maintain authority as they demanded explanations, and Ethan stepped into the broadcast room where a single console waited, one that had never been used before, and when he authorized the uplink, every screen carrying the Coalition signal cut to black for half a second, just long enough to be noticed, and then the image returned, not with alien faces, but with a simple view of Earth from orbit, unarmed and blue and peaceful. And Ethan's voice carried across the galaxy without raised volume or threat, as he said that humanity had heard the verdict and rejected it, that Earth would not accept defeat, that compliance was not in its nature, and that this message would play once, because repetition was unnecessary, and as he spoke, human fleets powered their drives in unison, not advancing, not firing, simply revealing scale, numbers climbing past estimates, past projections, past anything the Coalition had planned for, and Sereth felt something unfamiliar as tactical models collapsed in real time, because the humans were not scrambling, they were executing, and when the broadcast ended, it did not cut back to Coalition authority. It ended entirely, replaced by silence that stretched across command channels, and in that silence the first Coalition enforcement ship lost power without an explosion, its systems shut down by a signal it could not block, drifting helplessly as others followed, and Laura watched confirmation after confirmation appear with steady breathing, because this was only the beginning, the opening statement of a war that would not be. Loud at first, and on distant worlds alien leaders stare at frozen screens, realizing too late that humanity had not been waiting to see if it would be spared. It had been waiting to speak last, and the final broadcast had only just begun. The silence after the broadcast spread faster than panic, because coalition doctrine had never prepared its officers for a target that refused to behave as a target, and across command decks alien crews waited for orders that did not come while systems flickered and recovered in unstable patterns. And Ethan Brooks returned his seat as if the most important words of his life were already behind him, because now the work belonged to others, to fleets and analysts and commanders who had rehearsed this moment in secret for a decade, and Laura Bennett moved between stations confirming Phase 1 objectives without raising her voice, knowing that calm was contagious and fear was more dangerous than enemy fire, while above Earth Admiral Victor Hale gave the order that had been written years earlier but never spoken aloud, and human ships that had remained dark now activated layer defensive fields that bent sensor returns and rewrote threat tables across the coalition network, not through brute force, but through understanding, because humanity had spent generations watching how others fought and learning how they thought, and the coalition commander Sereth tried to reassert control by ordering a full retreat to regroup. But even that simple maneuver failed as drives refused to engage on schedules that made no sense, and it became clear that human interference was selective, not total, allowing confusion to bloom without revealing its limits, and on Earth news channels showed only calm skies and routine traffic, because the public had been told only what it needed to know, that their leaders had a plan, and that panic would help no one. And the plan unfolded with precision as isolated coalition ships were disabled and secured without loss of life, their crews stunned by how little violence was required to neutralize them, because humanity understood that fear multiplied when mercy contradicted expectation, and Laura received confirmation from deep space. Platforms at the first listening arrays had gone live, intercepting coalition emergency traffic and mapping the fracture lines forming inside their alliance. And Ethan listened as reports confirmed what he had hoped but never assumed, that the coalition was not unified under pressure, that old rivalries and grudges resurfaced immediately when dominance was questioned, and this too had been predicted because human history was full of coalitions that cracked when certainty vanished, and far. From Earth, a coalition council emergency session devolved into accusations, as members demanded to know how such a miscalculation had been possible, and the answer, though unspoken, was simple. They had believed their own narratives for too long, and as hours passed, the first human task groups crossed invisible thresholds into coalition-controlled space, not attacking population centers or symbols, but logistics nodes and command relays that mattered only to those who understood war deeply, and each successful action fed back into the growing realization among alien commanders that this was not a rebellion or a desperate stand. It was a demonstration, a controlled unveiling of capability meant to reshape assumptions permanently. And Ethan finally allowed himself a long breath as he watched the galaxy respond not with unified fury, but with hesitation, because hesitation was the true victory of the first day, and somewhere on a distant world an alien cadet would one day study this moment and learn the lesson that humanity had written carefully into the stars, that defeat was never something humans accepted simply because it was declared, and that any species willing to underestimate them would eventually hear a final broadcast of its own. As the first day turned into the second, the coalition's confusion hardened into fear, because fear filled the gaps where doctrine failed, and across dozens of systems alien commanders began issuing contradictory orders that collided with one another, retreating fleets blocking reinforcements, security forces locking down worlds that no human ship had even approached. And Ethan Brooks reviewed the situation from Earth with a steady focus of someone who understood that momentum was fragile, because too much pressure too fast could turn fear into unity, and unity was the one thing humanity could not allow the coalition to rediscover. So the strategy shifted subtly as Laura Bennett authorized Phase 2 actions that looked like restraint to an outsider, but were in fact carefully measured provocations, restoring partial function to selected coalition networks just long enough for arguments to spread, for accusations to be transmitted and censored, and for blame to attach itself to the loudest and oldest powers within the alliance. And Sereth watched this unraveling from the flagship with growing dread, as junior officers whispered and senior advisors fell silent, because the humans were not simply fighting ships, they were fighting belief, and belief once broken was hard to repair. And on distant frontier worlds, coalition governors faced riots, as populations demanded to know why the great alliance that promised eternal security could not even protect its own fleets from being quietly disarmed. And human task groups moved through these regions like ghosts, visible only when they wanted to be seen, leaving behind disabled stations and intact cities, because the message was never that humanity sought destruction, only that it now controlled the pace of events, and Admiral Victor Hale coordinated these movements with methodical patience, refusing requests from captains eager to press their advantage, reminding them that victory was not measured in territory taken, but in certainty removed and back on Earth. Carefully curated information was released to the public showing humanity standing firm without triumphalism, reinforcing a narrative of resolve rather than revenge. Because Ethan knew that the galaxy was watching how humans treated their own people as closely as how they treated their enemies, and within the Coalition Council Chamber, emergency meetings stretched into sleepless cycles as representatives argued whether to escalate or negotiate, and the very fact that negotiation was now spoken aloud marked a profound shift, because only days earlier humanity had not been considered worthy of terms. And as this debate raged, a second broadcast began to circulate through unofficial channels, not sent by Earth directly, but leaked intentionally, showing unedited footage of Coalition enforcement ships drifting powerless, while human crews rendered aid to stranded alien sailors, offering medical care and safe transport without demands, and the effect was immediate and destabilizing, because it contradicted centuries of propaganda that painted humans as reckless and brutal, and Sereth felt the floor's certainty give way beneath him as reports came in of Coalition captains refusing orders to fire on human vessels, citing confusion and safety concerns. And Ethan listened to these updates with a somber expression, because he understood that the most dangerous moment was approaching, the moment when the Coalition would either fracture beyond repair, or lash out with everything it had left, and humanity would have to be ready for both. And as stars continued to flicker with disabled relays and shifting alliances, one truth became impossible to deny across the galaxy, that the species expected to accept defeat had instead rewritten the rules of war, without raising its voice, and the consequences of that revelation were only beginning to unfold. By the fourth cycle, the Coalition's internal fractures were no longer hidden behind protocol, because protocol required confidence, and confidence had evaporated as entire sectors went silent by choice rather than force. Governors declaring neutrality, without permission, admirals delaying orders while demanding clarification that never arrived. And Ethan Brooks recognized the pattern instantly, because it mirrored moments in human history when empires collapsed not from invasion, but from disbelief in their own permanence, and he ordered that no effort be made to stop these defections, because letting them happen was more powerful than forcing them, while Laura Bennett coordinated diplomatic backchannels that had been prepared years earlier, reaching out not with threats but with statement of boundaries and expectations, making it clear that humanity did not seek to rule the Coalition's worlds but would no longer accept oversight, and this clarity unsettled alien leaders more than any ultimatum could have, because domination they understood, but refusal without conquest left them without a framework to respond, and Sereth watched as the Coalition flagship received fewer acknowledgments with every passing hour, its authority dissolving as captains deferred to local commands or simply powered down to avoid becoming targets, and in a desperate attempt to restore control, a hardline faction within the Council authorized a punitive strike against a human listening outpost near a neutral system, believing that a visible act of force would reassert dominance. But Admiral Victor Hale had anticipated this exact move, and the outpost was never meant to survive, because its destruction triggered a response that had been carefully constrained, a single human task group appearing in the attacking fleet's rear and disabling its command ship in seconds, capturing the officers alive and broadcasting their surrender across Coalition channels before any civilian harm occurred. And the psychological impact was devastating, because escalation had not led to fear but to exposure. And on Earth, Ethan listened to the captured officers speak under humane detention, not coerced but shaken, admitting openly that they no longer understood the strategic landscape, and these admissions spread faster than any official statement, feeding the growing realization that the Coalition's leadership had lost control of events entirely. And Laura observed this shift with measured concern, because chaos could turn unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous even for the side that seemed to be winning. So she advised restraint once more, limiting human actions to responses rather than initiatives, allowing the Coalition to exhaust itself internally. And across the galaxy, populations watched their supposed protectors argue and fail, while a species once dismissed as primitive acted with precision and consistency. And in council chambers, the question quietly, changed from how to punish humanity to how to survive the consequences of having provoked it. And as his unspoken fears settled in, Ethan prepared the next message, not a broadcast to dominate the airwaves, but a set of terms to be delivered privately to those willing to listen, because the time for proving strength was nearing its end, and the time for shaping what came after had begun. The fifth cycle marked the moment when the Coalition finally understood that the crisis was not temporary, because temporary problems could be delayed or contained, and this one only deepened with every hour. And Ethan Brooks read reports showing that trade routes once enforced by Coalition patrols were reopening under local authority, that member worlds were making independent security agreements, and that the idea of a single unified command was quietly dying without any official declaration. And Laura Bennett began transmitting carefully worded proposals to selected governments outlining a post-coalition framework based on mutual defense and non-interference, not as demands but as options, because giving others a choice was the fastest way to reveal who still believed in control and who simply wanted stability. And Admiral Victor Hale oversaw the redeployment of human fleets into visible but non-threatening positions, making sure they were seen protecting neutral shipping and responding to distress calls regardless of species, because actions spoken calmly over time carry more weight than any speech. And Sereth remained confined to a flagship as its crew grew increasingly distant, following orders mechanically but without conviction. And he realized that even if the Coalition survived in name, it would never again command unquestioned obedience. And that realization hurt more than defeat, because it meant history would remember this not as a lost war, but as a failure of judgment. And across Earth the public learned more of the truth as leaders explained that humanity had prepared not for conquest, but for survival, and that what the galaxy was witnessing was a result of patience and restraint rather than sudden brilliance, and this honesty strengthened resolve rather than weakening it, because people understood the cost of preparation and accepted it. And as smaller alien states formally requested talks with Earth, the Coalition Council struggled to respond, issuing statements that sounded authoritative but carried no enforcement. And when a second hardline faction attempted to rally support for a decisive strike, they found few willing participants, because no one wanted to be the next example quietly dismantled and publicly spared. And Ethan recognized that fear had shifted sides completely, no longer residing on Earth, but within the halls that once judged it. And he approved the release of the next phase, not a weapon or a maneuver, but a declaration shared privately with dozens of governments stating that humanity considered the conflict effectively over unless provoked further, and the response was immediate and telling. Acknowledgement arrived within minutes from worlds that had once voted unanimously against Earth, thanking humanity for clarity and requesting guarantees of peace. And as these messages accumulated, the Coalition's relevance faded further, becoming a shell of its former self, and Sereth finally requested a direct channel to Earth, not to threaten or bargain, but to ask a simple question, whether there was any path forward that did not end in humiliation. And Ethan considered the request carefully, knowing that how humanity treated its former judge would define the next era, and he authorized the channel, because the war humanity had refused to accept was already ending on its own terms. And what came next would shape the galaxy far longer than any battle ever could. When the channel opened between Earth and the Coalition flagship, the tone was different from every exchange that had come before, because there was no threat layered into the signal and no demand for immediate compliance. Only Sereth's controlled but strained voice asking for terms that would preserve some form of dignity. And Ethan Brooks listened without interruption, allowing the silence to do its work, because he understood that letting the Coalition speak first acknowledged reality, without conceding authority. And when he finally responded, he did not speak of punishment or victory, but of boundaries, stating plainly that humanity would not accept oversight, would not submit fleets for inspection, and would not allow foreign forces within its systems, but that it had no intention of dismantling other governments or rewriting cultures. And this balance unsettled Sereth more than anger would have, because it removed the familiar structure of domination and replacement. And Laura Bennett followed with precise conditions regarding disengagement zones and data transparency that would prevent accidental escalation, framing them as safeguards rather than concessions. And as these terms were transmitted, reports flowed in that more Coalition worlds were formally withdrawing, not out of loyalty to humanity, but out of exhaustion and pragmatism. And Admiral Victor Hale adjusted fleet postures accordingly, pulling back from contested regions to avoid the appearance of coercion, because now perception mattered more than force, and across the galaxy analysts and historians began reframing the conflict in real time, no longer calling a rebellion but an exposure, the moment when an assumed hierarchy collapsed under scrutiny, and Sereth admitted during the exchange that the coalition had underestimated humanity because it had mistaken noise for strength and restraint for fear, a confession that would later circulate widely and quietly erase centuries of propaganda. And Ethan acknowledged the statement without satisfaction, because understanding was the only acceptable outcome now, and as provisional agreements were drafted and transmitted to multiple parties simultaneously to prevent secret leverage, the sense of crisis eased into something heavier and more permanent, a reordering rather than a resolution. And on Earth, people went about their days with a calm that surprised off-world observers, because the absence of panic signaled confidence. And confidence was something the coalition no longer possessed. And as the channel closed and preparations began for a broader summit under neutral terms, Ethan allowed himself to consider the cost of what had been done, not in ships or lives, but in the burden of expectation now placed on humanity, because the galaxy had learned not just that humans would not accept defeat, but that when they spoke, they meant to be heard, and that understanding would shape every decision from this moment forward. By the seventh cycle, the galaxy had begun to settle into a new pattern because the shock of humanity's refusal to accept defeat had worn into cautious acceptance, and Ethan Brooks oversaw a period of strategic consolidation rather than aggressive action, knowing that the first impression had been made, and now the next moves required patience. While Laura Bennett coordinated the establishment of neutral observation posts on the edges of coalition space to monitor compliance with the agreements they had imposed, ensuring transparency without threat, and across former coalition territories, local governments and populations began negotiating directly with Earth representatives for trade, security, and scientific exchange, discovering that humanity's intentions were far more pragmatic than the coalition had feared, that protection and cooperation could exist without dominance. And this revelation shook long-held beliefs deeply, causing whispers of dissent among the remaining hardline commanders, because the rules they had relied on for centuries were no longer valid, and Sereth, confined a flagship that had once symbolized absolute authority, realized that every move he made was now interpreted as reactionary rather than commanding, and that the galaxy itself was watching to see if humanity's next actions would reinforce trust or reveal hypocrisy. And Ethan chose clarity, ordering that all human movements and communications continue under strict documentation to avoid misinterpretation, showing restraint while demonstrating capability, and Admiral Victor Hale ensured that every fleet maneuver was deliberate, visible, and carefully timed to signal both strength and discipline, while news from distant systems detailed the collapse of former coalition enforcement units who now operated independently, some forming alliances with humans voluntarily, others simply withdrawing from galactic politics altogether. And analysts noted that the collapse was not violent, but structural, a failure of belief rather than a loss of resources. And in Earth's halls of leadership, Ethan convened a council to plan the integration of newly aligned worlds, discussing education, infrastructure, and joint defense measures to ensure that the mistakes of the past would not recur. And Laura monitored the distribution of humanitarian aid to worlds still recovering from the coalition's neglect, knowing that these actions would reinforce trust faster than words alone. And as reports came in that former council members were publicly admitting errors in judgment, humanity's role shifted from underdog to stabilizer, a species once underestimated now actively shaping galactic norms. And Sarah submitted final reports not with triumph, but with resignation, acknowledging that the last vestiges of absolute control were gone, that the species they had tried to subdue had instead redefined power. And as the seventh cycle ended, Ethan reflected on the lessons learned that victory had never been about destruction, only the measured application of understanding, patience, and resolve, and that the galaxy now faced a future in which humans would always speak last and act with certainty, a fact that would echo in every council chamber for generations to come. As the eighth and final cycle unfolded, the galaxy finally grasped the full scale of what humanity had accomplished, because the coalition, once confident and unchallenged, was now a fragmented collection of states and factions, each recalibrating its policies and military doctrines in response to a species that had refused to submit and had done so with precision and restraint. And Ethan Brooks oversaw the careful transition from active operations to long-term strategy, ensuring that no opportunity for reconciliation or constructive influence was lost, while Laura Bennett coordinated permanent communication networks with neutral and former coalition worlds to maintain stability and prevent misunderstandings, and Admiral Victor Hale managed the final repositioning of human fleets, not in preparation for conflict, but as a visible demonstration of readiness and discipline, a message that humanity's capabilities could not be ignored even in times of peace. And across former coalition territories, local governments enacted reforms, replacing rigid hierarchies with councils that included representatives of aligned worlds, many openly acknowledging that Earth had demonstrated what the coalition had consistently underestimated, that humans combined patience, ingenuity, and moral restraint in ways alien civilizations had failed to predict, and Sereth, now returning to a home system long familiar, yet profoundly changed in perception, filed final reports detailing every tactical misstep and psychological misjudgment, noting that the coalition's collapse had been as much a failure of arrogance as of resources, and as humans continue to broadcast messages of reassurance and cooperation, not dominance or threat, the galaxy began to adapt to a new paradigm, one in which humanity's reputation for resolve and strategic foresight became a guiding influence, and historians would later record the events not as a war, but as a demonstration, a lesson in understanding that strength without cruelty, preparation without panic, and patience without weakness could reshape entire civilizations. And on Earth, as citizens observed the skies and returning fleets, Ethan, Laura, and Victor reflected silently on the decades of preparation and sacrifice that had led to this moment, understanding that the final broadcast had not just announced humanity's refusal to accept defeat, but had irrevocably altered the balance of power, the expectations of allies and adversaries alike, and the very trajectory of galactic history. And in that quiet reflection, they realized that the galaxy would never again misjudge humanity, that respect born from comprehension and experience had replaced fear, contempt, and assumption, and as the stars continued to shine over worlds newly aligned, humanity settled into its role with vigilance, honor, and the knowledge that the lesson delivered in the final broadcast would echo for generations, a permanent reminder that those who underestimate the human spirit do so at their own peril, and that even the most confident powers must recognize that humanity's place in the cosmos would always be defined by resilience, intelligence, and an unyielding refusal to accept anything less than sovereignty, freedom, and the right to determine its own destiny, leaving the galaxy forever changed by the species it had once dismissed.